Boston. That's a really tough matchup, of course. Just what are some of the important things to consider when you guard a player like Aaliyah?
Yeah, she's really good, and
The bright arena lights of Gainbridge Fieldhouse cut sharply through the atmosphere on that fateful May evening, casting long shadows across Caitlin Clark's face as she sat in near silence in the Indiana Fever locker room, her jersey heavy with sweat after an electrifying debut that showcased 20 points, several assists, and a command of the court that reminded everyone why she was one of the most anticipated rookies in WNBA history. Yet none of those numbers, nor the applause that had roared through the stands, could touch the private storm brewing inside her chest as tears slid down her cheeks, not from exhaustion or joy, but from a deeper grief tied to a phone call she had received just hours before the game that forever transformed what should have been the happiest, most triumphant night of her young professional career into something more layered, bittersweet, and painfully human. For how is it possible, she wondered in those private moments, that our greatest triumphs can sometimes feel like our most profound losses, as though the people we most long to share them with are missing from the very stage where their presence would have meant the most. And in her case, the absence was not merely physical but eternal, because the one person whose voice she longed to hear, whose eyes she longed to meet in that moment of history, was no longer alive to witness what she had worked her entire life to achieve. And yet, paradoxically, it was that very person, her late grandfather Robert Clark, whose unseen hand guided every shot she had taken that night and whose love, preserved in a series of letters no one knew existed, became the unspoken narrative of her debut, a story not of basketball statistics, but of legacy, love, and promises made across the threshold of life and death. Promises that transcend time and carry us forward even when our hearts are heavy. And this, though few outside her closest circle would ever truly know, was the hidden truth of why Caitlin's WNBA debut, celebrated on national broadcasts and in headlines, felt to her like both a soaring victory and a devastating loss. The morning of that day had begun with all the rituals and rhythms familiar to Caitlin. She rose early, centered herself through a brief meditation session that helped quiet her restless energy, ate her light but nourishing breakfast, and sat with game film to mentally prepare for the challenge ahead, imagining the defensive schemes she might face, the screens she would navigate, the long three-point shots she would unleash with her trademark confidence, and yet nothing in those controlled preparations could shield her from the emotional disruption that came crashing into her world at exactly 10:47 a.m. when her phone rang, its vibration carrying with it the weight of family and memory. And when she answered, she heard her mother Anne's voice, warm yet trembling, calling from the cemetery in West Des Moines where the Clark family had gathered to honor what would have been Robert Clark's 85th birthday, and Caitlin, who had always carried a close bond with her grandfather despite his quiet demeanor, immediately felt her chest tighten as her mother explained that her father, Brent Clark, wanted to read her something they had found among Robert's belongings, something discovered just the week before, and at first Caitlin braced herself for a simple anecdote, perhaps an old journal entry or note, but she could not have anticipated what came next, for what she learned was that her grandfather, a man of few spoken words, had been writing letters to her throughout her college career at Iowa, letters he had never delivered during his final months as he battled cancer, letters filled with encouragement, praise, and raw confessions of pride and love that he had struggled to articulate face-to-face. And as Brent's voice began reading one of them over the phone, Caitlin felt the weight of history and heartache converge, realizing that these letters, meant to be given when she made it to the WNBA, had finally reached her on the very morning of her professional debut, an alignment of fate so achingly perfect and cruel that it left her shaken, because now every moment on the court would carry the echo of his words, every dribble and shot infused with the memory of the man who believed in her long before millions did. And this knowledge cut her deeply, because though she had long dreamed of hearing his applause on such a stage, what she received instead were words from beyond the grave, a love that lived on paper but not in presence. Still, in her grief there was also a quiet sense of destiny, as though Robert had orchestrated this timing, gifting her the emotional fuel she needed. And indeed, when she stepped onto the court later that evening, the crowd roaring, The cameras flashing, the jerseys and posters filling the stands, Caitlin carried more than her own ambition. She carried a promise whispered years earlier, a vow made silently to her grandfather that she would keep striving, keep breaking barriers, and that she would one day stand exactly where she was standing, not only for herself but for him. And it was this weight that made her tears fall later in the locker room when the cheers had faded and the stat sheet was placed in her hands, reminding her that numbers could never measure the fullness of that night. What few knew was that tucked carefully inside her locker was not just a towel, not just shoes and tape, but a sealed envelope she had slipped into her bag that morning after her parents' call. One of Robert's letters that she could not bring herself to open before the game, saving it for afterward. Perhaps out of fear of losing focus, or perhaps because she wanted his words to be the final punctuation to the day. And as she sat alone, the echoes of the game still ringing faintly through the halls, she finally reached for it, her hands trembling as she unfolded the paper and saw her grandfather's handwriting, uneven from illness yet steady in its love. And as she read his words telling her that no matter what the scoreboard said, she had already made him proud, that her courage, resilience, and joy in the game were enough, Caitlin felt both shattered and whole, grieving his absence yet overwhelmed by the enduring presence of his spirit. And in that moment, she understood something profound about sports, about life, and about love. That sometimes the real victories are invisible, measured not by wins and losses, but by the ways love continues to guide us, even when the loved ones themselves are gone. And so her debut became not just a career milestone, but a sacred act of remembrance, a love story hidden in plain sight, transcending basketball, time, and even death itself. And this is why when fans and reporters looked at Caitlin Clark that night and saw the determined rookie, the record-breaking scorer, what they could not see was the private dialogue between her and her grandfather, a conversation carried through ink, memory, and heartache, a story that, once understood, reveals why triumph often walks hand in hand with loss, and why love, once planted, never truly dies but lives on it.
Really appreciate my teammates try to help me a lot, give me good feeling, and then cheer for me. I'm really appreciative. Yeah.
The letter was steady but emotional as Caitlin's father Brent began to read aloud, his voice breaking at points as though the words themselves carried the weight of an entire lifetime. And Caitlin, listening on the other end of the phone that morning of her debut, felt as if her breath had been stolen from her lungs. Because what she was hearing was not just a letter, but the resurrection of a love she had never fully understood when it was alive in the flesh. My dearest Caitlin, the words began, if you're hearing this, it means you've made it to the professional level, and I'm probably not there to see it in person. But I want you to know that every shot you take, every game you play, I'll be watching from wherever I am, cheering louder than anyone in the arena. At first it seemed like the kind of sentimental note a grandparent might leave, but then the sentences shifted into something deeper, something that pierced her soul. I know I wasn't always the best at showing my feelings when I was alive. I was from a generation that didn't talk much about emotions, but watching you play basketball taught me something about joy, about passion, about what it means to pursue something with your whole heart. You didn't just make me proud to be your grandfather. You made me proud to be human. Those words hit Caitlin like a physical blow, as though the air around her shifted, and she could no longer stand upright. Instead, she found herself sinking into the chair of her Indianapolis apartment, the sobs rising uncontrollably, not because she was only sad, but because she was overwhelmed by the magnitude of a love that had lived silently in the background of her life and was only now being revealed in full. The man who had driven her to countless youth tournaments, who had risen before dawn to make sure she had breakfast and water packed, who had sat quietly in the stands game after game, often not saying much beyond a nod or a smile, had apparently been carrying inside him feelings and reflections that he had never shared, a flood of love and admiration that was now breaking through the dam of his own silence from beyond the grave. What Caitlin did not realize until that day was that Robert Clark, her grandfather, had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer during her junior year at Iowa, a diagnosis he had kept from her deliberately, making a conscious decision not to tell her so that she could finish out her college career without distraction, so so that she could savor the moments of that last magical season without the shadow of impending loss. Instead, in those quiet months of decline, he had taken pen to paper, pouring out letters, page after page of love, encouragement, advice, and wisdom that he had never been able to express in person, leaving behind a trail of words that were meant to reach her when she was strong enough, when she had arrived at the very dream he had seen in her from the time she was a child barely able to lift a basketball. Caitlin had always known her grandfather was proud of her, but she had often wondered about the depth of his connection to her passion, because he was a farmer, a man of earth and weather, who spoke more through action than language, who expressed care through showing up rather than declaring feelings. Sometimes she had questioned whether he truly understood what basketball meant to her soul, whether he saw it as more than just a game. But then Brent's voice cracked again as he read the next part of the letter. Now, Caitlin, I want you to know that basketball was never what made me proud of you. What made me proud was watching you help your teammates, seeing you sign autographs for every kid who asked, witnessing the way you treated people with kindness even when you were tired or frustrated. The basketball was just the stage that let the world see what I already knew, that you have a heart as big as your talent. Caitlin pressed the phone tighter against her ear, her own tears now blurring her vision, because she understood in that instant that her grandfather had not simply been watching her play, he had been studying her character, measuring her not by her points or her assists, but by the way she treated others, the way she carried herself, the quiet dignity and joy she brought to the game. The letter continued with an even more profound truth. You can perceive that some of the most profound love stories aren't romantic. They're the quiet, steady love between generations. The kind of love that expresses itself through presence rather than words, through consistency rather than grand gestures. And it was then that Caitlin realized her entire childhood, every car ride to the gym, every quiet presence in the bleachers, every unspoken nod of approval had been a love story in itself, a steady current that carried her even when she did not know it. The final section of the letter was the part that broke her completely. When you play your first professional game, I want you to remember that you're not just representing yourself or your team, or even your family. You're representing every kid who has ever felt different, every young person who has been told they're too small or not good enough, every dream